The United States Grand Prix at the Circuit of the Americas reopened the debate on track limits after a couple of incidents involving Zhou Guanyu and Max Verstappen in qualifying. In this episode, we're going to explore what the rules really are and why there still seems to be a grey area around some off-track excursions. We're also going to delve into a couple of the on-track clashes from the Grand Prix itself, involving George Russell, Carlos Sainz, Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll. So let's kick off with a controversy from qualifying. What happened was a little bit confusing to those of us watching on TV because of the way it was portrayed on the broadcast. Zhou Guanyu was one of a number of drivers to have laps deleted for going outside of track limits during their qualifying laps. The first time this happened to Zhou was pretty inconsequential because he managed to go back out, do another lap and still qualify for Q2. But where it gets a little bit more complicated is his second offence, where he had his lap time deleted after Q2 and therefore didn't progress to Q3, even though originally he thought he'd made it through. On the TV broadcast, we were shown an example from an onboard camera of Zhou running wide, but it wasn't possible really to determine from that angle whether or not he had run wide. Because of the perspective of the camera, there's no way of seeing actually whether or not the tyre is outside of the white lines. Shortly after this, images started to appear on social media comparing Zhou's deleted lap with a lap from Max Verstappen from Q1, which looks near identical where his lap time wasn't deleted. And fans and observers were quite rightly a little bit confused as to why these two apparently identical offences have been dealt with differently. But as with many of these things, there's more to the story than that. So firstly, let's explain how these track limit violations are actually dealt with by the FIA. The race director himself couldn't possibly be looking at every single off-track violation in real time as they're happening, with so many cars and so many corners to police. So there's a panel of people with the job to review the footage throughout the session. And if they see anything which could potentially be a track limits violation, they then escalate that to the race director. If at that point the race director agrees, then the lap will be deleted. In the case of the comparison between Zhou Guanyu and Max Verstappen, we were being misled by the still image, because if you follow the footage just a few meters further down the track, it's quite clear that Zhou does go outside the track limits, and so the comparison with Verstappen's potential infringement isn't a fair one. So we've established that both of Zhou's laps were correctly deleted, but that still leaves us with the question mark over whether or not Verstappen's should also have been deleted, and this is where it gets even more complicated and annoyingly murky. The first problem is the footage we have simply isn't clear enough to show definitively the positioning of the tyre and the edge of the track. We need a better camera angle, a lot closer to the potential offence, to really say definitively where that tyre was lined up versus the edge of the white line. But it gets even worse when you look at the wording of the rules, which in the section relating to track limit violations state drivers will be judged to have left the track if no part of the car remains in contact with it, and for the avoidance of doubt, any white lines defining the edge of the track are considered to be part of the track, but the curbs are not. Now the seemingly crucial part of that is if no part of the car remains in contact with it. So that would tend to suggest that we need physical contact between the car, so the tyre's contact patch, and the track surface within the bounds of the track limits in order for a lap to be deemed legal. And that would mean that even if the tyre was above the white line or even the tarmac surface, and if you drew a straight line down from the edge of the sidewall to the track surface, the car would clearly be within those bounds. If it's not physically in contact with the surface, then it's not legal. And in many situations, reading the rules that way would be problematic. Say for example when cars bounce over curbs and sometimes none of the tyres are in contact with the track. That obviously doesn't automatically mean that that driver should receive a track limits violation because all four wheels are no longer in contact with the track surface. And so back to the Verstappen example, that means that even though it looks like the contact patch of the tyre that's physically in contact with the road surface may not be within the bounds of the track limits, the fact that the edge of his tyre's sidewall when viewed from above may be overhanging the edge of the white line, by the normal interpretation of how we police these rules, probably does mean that that was legal. But the problem is we don't even know that for sure, because you just can't see clearly enough from the angle that we've been provided. It's my personal view that if you can't prove beyond doubt that the driver was outside of the limits, then you do need to give them the benefit of the doubt and rule in their favour. So in this example, it probably was correct to allow Verstappen's lap to stand. What we need is a better way of policing this with no human judgment involved at all, an automatic system where you're either out or in. And there are a number of ways we could do this without too much hassle. Other series place sensors in the middle of the car, or even sensors in the curbs themselves to judge definitively whether or not a car is outside of the bounds. And if you trigger those sensors, there's no arguing. There's no human looking at the footage and deciding whether or not you were legal. Your lap is automatically deleted and you have to try again. And that fact is instantaneously communicated with you and your team, so you don't have to wait to find out until after the session where you can't do anything about it. Failing that, we could easily mandate cameras positioned on the cars at an angle which shows clearly whether or not the tyre is inside or outside of the track limits, and the regulations should be tidied up to clarify exactly what they mean by contact with the track, because as we've already explored, the wording seems to say one thing but actually intend a completely different thing when you look at the way this is historically policed and the precedents we've had set from the past. So now let's take a look at the race-defining clashes that happened during the USA Grand Prix. So let's start with the Turn 1 accident between George Russell and Carlos Sainz, which ultimately ended Sainz's race and landed George Russell with a 5-second penalty which he served at his first pit stop. The cars on the left-hand side of the grid appeared to get better starts than those on the right, at least for the first couple of rows, which led to Verstappen getting ahead of Sainz going up to Turn 1 and Russell drawing alongside and attacking his teammate Hamilton. As the frontrunners neared the exit of the first corner, Verstappen checked up slightly. He hesitated on the throttle, probably to avoid running wide on the exit, and Sainz was forced to adjust his line, attempting to cut to the left of Verstappen to get a better run down the hill in an attempt to draw alongside. Meanwhile, behind this, Russell was keeping a watchful eye on Hamilton, who was just on his right-hand side, and had a small lock-up as he approached the apex. But what he hadn't factored in was that slight slowing of the front two, and Sainz changing his trajectory to try and cut past Verstappen. In short, Russell had committed to using the full width of the track on the exit, which was now no longer available to him. This led to him giving Sainz's car a very strong whack, which spun him around and gave him race-ending damage. Now, it's difficult to lay the blame anywhere other than Russell on this one. You can see the extenuating circumstances. You can see what unfolded ahead of him wasn't what he predicted, but that's still not Sainz's fault, and it was only really Russell who could have done anything to avoid this. So I think we have to chalk this one up to a reasonably rare error from George, and I think he was quite happy to accept his punishment. So next, let's move on to one which is even more clear-cut, and that's the big crash between Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll. Alonso had got a brilliant run on Stroll heading down the longest straight on the circuit, and was using the slipstream and DRS to great effect as he closed in on Stroll's rear wing. At the last moment, Alonso jinked to the left-hand side to begin the pass, and a split second after this, Lance Stroll reacted to it and also turned to the left. This gave Fernando absolutely nowhere to go, and with zero reaction time, immediately the two cars made contact, throwing Alonso into the air and then into the barriers, and sending Stroll spinning down the track with significant damage. After the race, Stroll claimed he'd left Alonso enough room, but that really ignores the real problem here, which was Stroll's late decision to react to Alonso's move. Reactionary defenses like this can be extremely dangerous, because the car behind is almost always committed to using a space which you've just taken away from them. Quite often this happens in braking zones, but it can equally happen on a straight when there's a big overlap in speed, and that's exactly what we saw here. It's my view that sometimes drivers just need to accept defeat, and if you haven't defended early enough, you need to try something different. You can't get out of the problem by defending too late and risking or causing a big accident. Ultimately, Stroll was out of the race, and somehow Alonso continued and scored points, although these were later taken away when he was given a 30-second penalty for Alpine allowing the car to rejoin the race in an unsafe condition. I'm not sure I agree with that penalty, because the officials had plenty of time to give the Alpine a black and orange flag if they thought there was something wrong with the car, but regardless, it was impressive effort from both the team and Alonso to get that car to the finish after everything it had been through in that crash. So there's now barely any time until the next Grand Prix at Mexico. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you next week after the Mexico City Grand Prix.